Okay, folks, let's get started. A couple things. One, the exam should be graded by noon today. I have my grader who's doing the essay portions of your tests, bringing those exams to me today after class, and then as soon as I can, I'm going to migrate your grades up on Moodle so you can see what you got, and then Thursday you'll get the physical test back. That's the current plan. Okay, so to repeat, the exams are basically all graded. I just need to migrate all the grades into my spreadsheet to then put up on Moodle so you can see what you got on each piece of the exam. It will be split between the multiple choice portion, the essay portion, the total, and whether or not you got the extra credit, though the extra credit can be used at any time. Okay, so that's the idea, and then hopefully we'll have that up by noon, or sometime certainly by the end of business today, and then Thursday you'll get the physical exams back. So that's the current plan. Any questions on that? Your next exam in here is October 28th. Okay, so basically 4 weeks from today. Okay. So watch for that. So where we're going between now and then is basically, we went, the first few weeks in here were really about, let's say, definitional stuff and kind of getting things started for macro. The middle portion of this class is really about policy and setting you up for looking more deeply at the choices the macroeconomists make to move themselves forward. So the first round on that is what we're going to call the business cycle. Okay? Now the business cycle is basically the movement of gross domestic product as a percentage change over time. And we assume that economies cycle. Why is that true? Why would an economy go through so-called cycles? Meaning you grow for a while, you stop growing, and then you go into what's known as recession, but then you actually stop recessing at some point, and you grow again. And that cycle is a classic characteristic of almost every single economy out there. Why? Why are there cycles? Anybody? Huh? So consumer demand changes, okay. And what is consumer demand changing going to cause? Okay. In the sense that what triggers that change in demand? Expectations. So the idea is that the cycle takes place because as incomes grow, we become more confident as consumers, we consume more, and as we consume more, what is going to happen naturally as a byproduct of increasing demand? What will be created in markets? Shortages or surpluses? Shortages. So as demand increases, goods become more scarce. And as goods become more scarce, what happens to their price? It goes up. And as prices go up, what happens to the amount demanded by consumers? It goes down. So if I give you more income, you consume more of that income, and then the price changes and rises as a reaction to the scarcity created by your new consumption pattern. So growth then begets inflation, which then begets recession. And that causes the cycle. So a lot of macroeconomics and policy making is about how you can basically be ahead of the inflation movement, because as soon as consumers contract their demand based on higher prices, what are businesses going to do as a reaction to forecasting lower consumer demand? Do they start hiring more people if they expect there's going to be less demand, or do they start letting people go? They let people go. So that inflation, which then creates unemployment, the two walk hand in hand. And it tips us back into recession. And what recession does is recession causes surpluses in markets, which then lower prices and gets us bottomed out and gets us rolling again back toward recovery. And that is, in a sense, how business cycles work. So you can see here, this is alternating periods of economic growth and contraction. We're going to define all that. And then there's these three questions that the book claims it's going to try to answer in this chapter, at least try to tee up for the rest of the book, is how stable is a market-driven economy? What forces cause so-called instability? And can the government do anything to promote what it claims to be steady economic growth? And really what business cycle analysis boils down to is, can you identify where you are vis-a-vis full employment, and what types of policies should you put in place, if any, to create better conditions than just letting the market go as it wants to. Because market forces cause some, as we've talked about so far in this class, some unwanted costs alongside of the great benefits that markets provide. So one of the things we talked about a long time ago, like the first day, was the so-called invisible hand idea, or how markets seemingly move based on self-interest. Well, one of the governmental reactions to that is to just let it go as a market. And another way of saying that is this French phrase called laissez-faire. And in essence, what that means is that you sort of a hands-off, or you leave it alone, with the idea that no intervention by the government is potentially the best solution for an economy. And before the Great Depression, that was, in a sense, how almost every economy on planet Earth worked short of a wartime scenario. That government intervention was very small. Part of that was logistics. It was very difficult over a vast landscape, specifically for countries like the United Kingdom, to command governmental policy from 9,000 miles away when there's a territory or some part of the Commonwealth that exists some other place on planet Earth. So a lot of the larger economies that had the governmental ability to actually generate more growth still had a logistics problem. As the 20th century dawned, and specifically in the 1930s, it became slightly easier and then very easy to generate governmental policy that basically had global effects. Well, before 1930, not only was there a logistics issue, but there also was a philosophical one in the sense that should the government be such a big part of our lives? What was a big deal in the beginning of the 20th century in terms of revolutions that took place throughout Europe? What types of revolutions took place? One specific in Russia. Yeah, communism became an actual political form, though it was not really communism in the sense of Marx. It was more of a very left socialism, didn't quite get to communism, but got pretty close, which was heavy government involvement. So looking at a centrally planned economy, which is the ultimate governmental involvement statement, where basically I'm telling you how many goods are going to be available and at what prices, and I dictate all markets, the idea of laissez-faire was somewhat challenged. And in countries that were not ready to take on more socialism and moving toward communism, but wanted to experiment with the government getting involved, it started to have some revolutionary effects without having the political turnover in Western Europe. So one of the things that was challenged right away is this idea of classical economics, which was the Adam Smith idea, that markets will simply drive us toward the best social outcome. And as a result of that, in the aggregate, there was a philosopher, mathematician named Jean-Baptiste Say, which led to this idea called Say's law. And Say's law suggests that in a market economy, supply will create its own demand. Now let's think about that for a minute. Supply creating its own demand. What that basically means is that if you provide it, goods will come. It's another way of thinking about that. You build it and they will come. Okay? So as long as we're creating goods and services, people will follow that. In other words, demand will just simply follow supply. Okay? Now, generally speaking, that is great for an agricultural market. Because in agriculture, people need to eat. So it's pretty obvious that that might happen. But as you get into manufactured goods and services, it's not as easy to assume that that's going to be true. But the basic idea is that if market forces prevail, Say's law will prevail, and economies will move toward equilibrium simply because the supply is there. Say's law has been applied most specifically to labor markets. If people are sitting around not working, what is naturally going to happen to wages? They're going to fall. Why? There's kind of two ways of thinking about it that are related to each other. Wages should fall when there's people not working, because in a real cold-blooded sense, what's true in the marketplace? There's a surplus. The current wage level, there's more people who want to work than businesses that want to hire them. So we would expect wages to fall with the idea as wages fell, demand would basically clean up the excess supply. But the second thing about labor markets in that sense is that at some point wages are going to fall because those people that aren't working are going to want to what? At some point. They're going to want to work because they got to eat. So at some point you will accept a lower wage simply because you've got no choice. You need to generate income. So we expect that supply, in a sense, will create its own demand, and labor markets are a great showcase of that. All right? But that's one view, assuming that markets work without an issue. And that's sort of the doctrine of classical economics, is that the market will take care of itself. If there's excess supply conditions, the market will clean it up. If there's excess demand conditions, the market will clean it up. You do not need to intervene to force equilibrium to take place. Okay? And this sort of talks about that idea that the economy, in a sense, is self-regulating. And we've talked about this in the past. So I'm breezing through some of this simply because we have talked about the way the market mechanism works, and this is just simply another viewpoint on the market mechanism. So let's do a 30-second quick review. The idea of a business cycle is that we're going to naturally go through growth and recession. Okay? Part of that is because the economy is self-regulating through markets. The market drives us towards shortages and surpluses, and then the market reacts to that in such a way that it slows down demand. So demand increases when supply increases, and then once it gets too pricey, demand starts to contract, and then supply contracts, and then demand and supply come back together again. But that's sort of the way that the old look at cycles work, that they would just naturally self-regulate. And that's the idea of so-called safe law. Okay? Are there any questions on that? All right, cool. Well, what happens when that stops working? In other words, suppose we start supplying goods and services and nobody comes. Okay? Well, the Great Depression kind of tested that theory, and a guy named John Maynard Keynes, who is probably the most famous macroeconomist ever, next to Adam Smith, where it's sort of it's kind of apples and oranges in comparison, but we still see Keynes as the cornerstone of what we look at as a macroeconomist. And he wrote in the early 1930s about these issues, where he said, look, one of the biggest problems with markets is while yes, they do work, you may not like the time lag it takes for them to work. So classical economics suggests that when a shortage or surplus takes place, or there's some macro failure, we're not in equilibrium, the market will immediately react to that. In other words, the information about that shortage and surplus will naturally transmit itself to the market participants in such a way that we will react immediately with no issue. Keynes suggested that people don't work that way. And in fact, governments have an ability where the experiment that took place in Russia in the late 19-teens and early 20s and into all the way to the late 80s, which of course Keynes died in 1946, so he didn't see that all come to fruition. But the idea is he saw that there was some power behind the idea of utilizing the government more completely as a market driver. He didn't believe in communism, but he did believe that you could have a little bit more of a governmental element to your economy to regulate, in a sense, the highs and the lows of business cycles. And one of the things that it was experienced by most emerged economies, or what you can think of as advanced economies between, let's say, 1850 and 1937, was high volatility in these cycles. So instead of having what you can think of as a nice smooth transition from recession to growth, you had these wild cycles of massive growth periods followed by massive downturns. And the Depression was, in a sense, the biggest of them all. And the idea was, why don't we use governmental policy to pull us out? So the idea is that if there's some inefficiency or an inability for the market to self-adjust, isn't there something the government could do to boost the economy? And the idea behind that is what you think of as a macro failure. There's something not working from the macroeconomy standpoint to get the economy moving back out of recession. So government intervention is something that is actually somewhat new to the modern world. It is not something that has been around forever. In other words, we have not had Obamacare, we have not had increased or massive monetary policy movements, except for, like, let's say the last 50 or 60 years. Okay, before that, it was a very open, market-driven economy almost everywhere in the world. But one of the reasons why governments got involved is because economists looked at what Keynes was writing and said, hey, guess what, let's see what happens. So how many people here have heard of the so-called New Deal during the Roosevelt administration? Okay. The New Deal was, in a sense, claimed to be the first real Keynesian experiment. And we're going to refer to John Maynard Keynes' writings as the Keynesian philosophy or Keynesian economics, was a real experiment in that. If the government got heavily involved in generating jobs, would in fact this boost what otherwise was a languishing economy that did not have a direction to itself? And so the idea would be, if governments got involved, what should they do? Well, they could do so by generating more output. In other words, providing goods and services, employing more people, providing more income transfers, and making more money available. What that boils down to, the first three are what we're going to call later fiscal policy, where the government intends to spend more money either by generating new goods and services and hiring people to do that, like building bridges, building dams, the things that happened during the New Deal. What we've seen since 2009 in the United States, for example, we're seeing roadways under construction. A lot of that was federally driven money that is either matched by local authorities and or the state, but a lot of it was ultimately coming to us because the Obama administration made an investment in our infrastructure, very similar to the New Deal in philosophy, to try to get our economy out of the recession. And we're still seeing some of the lingering effects of that. Now, you might not like it because you're stuck in traffic going, oh my God, is this thing really happening again? But part of that is because people are working. Okay, so that's that trade-off again. All right? The more money made available is what we're going to call later monetary policy. Can we use the printing of money to generate more jobs, more output, and ultimately more income for people? And that's something that we'll debate heavily later in the course because we've had a lot of experiments with that worldwide over the last 6 or 7 years. Now that's for an underperforming economy. That's when we are languishing in recession and can't quite get out. The opposite is also true. Can the government come into one in which inflation is rising relatively rapidly and we're starting to see the social ills of inflation? Well, we can in the sense that we can stop spending as much money, we can reduce how much money is available, and we can increase taxes. So the government in the Keynesian philosophy has an ability to sort of reduce the amplitude of those cycles, or how high the peaks are and how low the valleys are in that cycle. That's the basic idea of Keynesian economics. Can we use governmental intervention, whether it be fiscal policy, the spending or taxation decisions of Congress in the United States, or monetary policy, what the Federal Reserve does, to, in a sense, shape the business cycle? Okay, that's the question we're going to have for a long time in this course, starting with this idea. Okay? Are there any questions on that at this point, or any comments, or anything at all? Okay, we are living right now in a time in which we are seeing unprecedented governmental intervention in our lives. Okay? I mean, the amount of spending that's taking place at the government level over the last 5 or 6 years is bigger than what the New Deal was by far. The amount of money that has been printed over the last 5 or 6 years is by far the largest in human history. And the question is, where does that leave us? Okay? Where does that leave us ultimately in terms of a macroeconomy? So we will see those issues unfold over the rest of the semester. So this is a very stylized picture of what you should expect. And like I said, it's kind of like a sine wave or a cosine wave in trigonometry, where it has this sort of movement over time, this cyclic effect, peak then trough, peak then trough, peak then trough. Okay? The claim is that you get that because the markets are constantly adjusting. Okay? So the 4 portions of this are the peak, where we start to see a turn in the macroeconomy from growth to recession. A recession is where we're actually declining in GDP. So real GDP is on the vertical axis, and this is time. Any downturn in that is considered to be recessionary. But true recession is happening when we actually have downturns in growth rates that are below trend. So there's a little bit of weirdness in how we define growth versus recession as macroeconomists. Troughs are where we actually see a transition from recession back into growth, and recovery is where we see ourselves moving back toward the peak. Bottom line is this. We know markets are going to cycle. One of the biggest things a macroeconomist does in practice is help identify where the transition points are. from peak to trough. There is a lot of power in being able to say we're closing in on the peak or we're getting close to the trough. This is true for financial market activity. It's true for labor market activity, housing market activity, general business. Being able to predict when demand is going to, in a sense, fall down or pick back up is very powerful. And this is really, again, a reflection of demand cycles, if anything else. Are there any questions on this graph? Yes?
Sorry, did you say depression is when it works trends?
No, thank you for asking that question. Depression is where we have a very long recession or very deep recession. So recession is when we are going below that growth trend line and going down like this. That's kind of a hand-wavy way of thinking about recession. Depression is when that state exists for some longer time than we expected. And so depression is something that's thrown around very quickly by people because a lot of us can be economically depressed for a lot longer time than other people. But generally speaking, depressions are for very deep, long recessions, longer than we expected, and are very rare in modern economies. All right? So we, in the United States, we basically, since 1920, have had two major recessions, which were the Great Depression and what we just experienced in 2008. 1979 to 1982 was a double-dip recession, but it had different characteristics than the Great Depression and the recent recession. And we'll talk about the contrast of those later in the course. That's a great question you asked, because a lot of people conflate recession and depression. Don't do that. Okay. 2001 and 2, we had a very mild recession because growth rates fell a little bit and then picked right back up in 2002 and off we went on another major growth cycle. Okay. We recessed, but not very much. Anybody else? Everybody doing all right? Okay. This point is subtle, but I think it's good to know. We expect growth as a trend to be upward sloping. In other words, we expect real gross domestic product to constantly trend upward. Why? And I say this is a subtle point on this graph, but it actually has large implications. Go ahead. So our expectation is that nominal GDP will continuously rise downwards. We will continuously build, or in a sense, generate more goods and services and value. Good. I have another hand up over here. Who had their hand up? Nobody? I thought I saw a hand up, sorry. And we expect that to outpace growth of prices, constantly. So as long as nominal GDP outpaces the growth of prices, or what we call inflation, we should see this trend line have a positive slope. There are economies that struggle to maintain a positive slope to this growth trend. Japan is a great example of this since 1992. Their growth trend of GDP has flattened since 1992. Okay? Now if this is the American growth trend, the Japanese growth trend before 1992 was like this. And now it's like this. And the reason is because they slowed down in the amount of goods and services that they were able to produce. And a lot of that is because they had population growth, but not necessarily in the productive age groups. So Japan is one of the fastest aging societies on planet Earth. And they are going through kind of a weird socioeconomic experiment right now with how do you deal with an aging population that has reduced how many babies they have and does not necessarily have a workforce coming behind it, with an aging population that probably will live a lot longer than they expect. The United States will also experience that in the 2020s and the 2030s. China will have the same experiment going on in about the same time frame as the United States, just with a lot more people. Okay? So watch this issue called demographic dividends coming up, where we're seeing the end of that in societies like the United States, Japan, Western Europe, and China. That this big bubble of people is starting to get older and less productive, which means that growth trend is going to start to flatten a little bit, unless we do something soon. Okay? So think about that a little bit. This is a quick look at American history since basically 1927-ish. where 1929 is right here, where we had a massive drop-off after the crash in the 1930. And the Great Depression time was where we really had deep, deep depression here. You can see that even after World War II, we had a pretty deep depression, but a lot of economists just write this off as sort of a snapback effect of a lot of service people coming back from World War II and causing a lot of unemployment and basically the classic transition from a mobilized economy. So this is sort of washed away in American history as not that big a deal. And you can see after that, recessions were not that long, except for this one, which again is the 1979 through 1982 recessions, so-called double dip. And then here's the Great Recession in historic context. So the reason we call that the last recession, the so-called Great Recession, is because technically we saw the lowest negative growth rates of GDP that we had seen since the Depression time, short of there being war. Okay? With all that in mind, notice the so-called cyclic aspects of this. Up and down, up and down, up and down, da 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 da. Okay? So the American economy has gone through this. What has happened since, let's say, 1985? What has happened to, let's say, the volatility of the American economy, if this is one way of looking at it? Has become, go ahead.
I was going to say there's more recessions, or more serious vertical recessions than there are
Growth or recoveries? Yeah, good. Good. That the recessions themselves, you can see, seem more deep than the recovery periods do. That's true. The one thing about those recessions, they may seem more negative than we've seen positive, but the growth cycles generally have a longer time period than the recessions do. Since World War II, most growth periods last about 62 months. Most recessions last about 18. So while they're deeper in terms of change of GDP, they tend to last a shorter time period. Okay, at least on average. The thing that was nasty about the last recession is it was deep and relatively long, and still lingers with us in some ways. Okay? Any questions on this? Cool. So here's some more just classic definitions here about business cycles: growth, recession, depression. We kind of talked about those. But the one I want to focus on with this slide or this idea is so-called growth recession. We can actually have what's known as a growth recession. In many ways, our recovery in the United States from the Great Recession had growth recession elements, where we were growing, but we were growing below long-term trend. So it just feels like the economy's kind of sputtering along. We're basically in that right now. We're in a slow-moving, positively moving, but not really booming economy. Okay? So economic growth, you can think of it, you can use the word expansion, boom, growth cycle, whatever. All those basically mean that we're growing above trend. A growth recession means we're growing, but it's slower than the long-term trend, which means we still have some recessionary elements in our economy. Recession is when we have negative growth of GDP, payroll employment, and generally our equity markets are languishing in terms of slow growth or potentially negative growth. And depression, as suggested, is when we have an extremely deep recession, and usually a longer one than we expect. Any questions on those terms? We've hit a lot of those already. Growth recession is something that we haven't really talked about yet, but the idea there is that growth recession is where we're growing at a very slow pace. And that's really what our recovery has been since 2010, has been a growth recession. Very slow moving, not booming, a below trend recovery. Okay? Any questions on that? So, this just reminds us that we saw some wild activity between 2008 and 2009. But in your own words, what created the Great Recession? Why did the last recession we experienced happen? What happened? What caused it? So we had a financial crisis triggered by housing markets. That's usually one culpable party. What else? Yes. So we had a banking crisis in the sense that banks were seen as less liquid or had less cash available than they should have. Okay? It was not as big an issue as what happened, let's say, in the 1980s or in the 1930s, but it had some elements of that. Go ahead. What's that? So Bernie Madoff and the so-called Ponzi scheme that he was involved in made a lot of headlines, and it was a microcosm of things going on, but it was not as big a deal in the macroeconomy as we think it was. It was just a really nice, sort of sensational headline, but it underscored the idea that some people were taken advantage of in markets. Good. What theme have we been talking about today? Let's do staying away. What's the theme of today? The business cycle. Were we naturally going to start to tip over into recession anyway? Yeah, we were seeing rising prices, moving toward full employment, the classic signs that the cycle was coming to an end. The haymaker happened when the financial crisis took place and basically knocked us over the side. And when you take natural cyclic movement downward based on inflation and rising interest rates, in other words, cost of business rising, and you stack on top of that really quick contractions in consumer demand because consumers are losing wealth at the same time that they're losing their job, you see a real quick movement downward. So those are the things that coupled together make the Great Recession bigger than previous recessions, really back to the Great Depression in terms of magnitude. If you look at the 1979 to 1982 recession, that was really what we think of as a supply side recession. We saw a contraction in oil markets, which then transmitted themselves throughout the macroeconomy in terms of higher prices. Inflation rose very quickly, which did not happen in the last recession. Prices, in fact, fell, which, as we talked about a couple weeks ago, have also some negative aspects in terms of prices going down leads to business decisions that aren't so good for the macroeconomy to continue to grow. But those are contrasting views of how you go into recession. The last recession was in many ways a demand-based recession, where demand contracted very quickly and slowed our economy down. The 1979-1982 double-dip recessions were really supply-side contractions. We have the supply side of our economy, the business side, contracting very quickly, and consumers reacting to that as prices went up very quickly. We have not seen high inflation rates like we saw in 1979 to 1982 since that time, because policymakers, going back to the idea of government intervention, have been a lot more focused on making sure prices remain relatively stable, which has made our recessions and booms, other than the last one, more stable and usually more elongated in terms of the boom times, or the so-called expansion periods. Okay? But what basically happened in the Great Recession was that demand contracted. But a lot of us think it was consumer demand only. So we want to be careful there. It was business and consumer demand simultaneously contracting, which leads to a real nasty recession. Usually one is contracting, not both simultaneously. Okay? So the book gives this as a way of thinking about how the macroeconomy works with respect to business cycles. And I'm going to break this down for you very quickly because in a sense we've talked about a lot of this already, but here's the bottom line. For what we're going from here in this course, we're going to assume that there are internal market forces in the macroeconomy and things that are happening domestically, global or so-called external shocks, and then how government is involving itself at the macro level with fiscal and monetary policy. Those are the determinants, if you will, of how the macroeconomy is moving forward. We look at things like output, employment, prices, the growth of all those above, and what's happening with international trade as metrics to measure how or what we can do, how we're being affected by those determinants, and ultimately what we can do with those determinants to get to a better outcome with those metrics. Okay? So in a sense, most of where we're going for the rest of this course is looking at that split and how they balance between each other. The determinants leading to the outcomes by how the macroeconomy is affected. Okay? We know a lot of this already, no big deal. One of the things we want to watch for later is going to be the international balances piece. Why should we care about international trade? What's the point of a macroeconomy either generating more trade or reducing it? What should that lead to? Anybody? Do we want more trade? Why? Oh, okay. Thank you for being honest. That's okay. Consumers want more trade because it gives us more choice. Okay? Generally, it also gives us lower prices. Businesses don't necessarily want more trade unless they're exporting. Because more trade, more imports usually means more competition. So one of the things that's wild about international trade, as you get bigger as an economy, you usually become more dependent on international trade because trade gives you more available goods and services and more markets on exports. So there's costs and benefits to becoming more open as an economy. It's something we'll talk about later. As you grow as an economy, you usually grow both domestically and internationally. And one of the things that can tip you over into recession is what happens with import markets in terms of pricing. Because as those prices rise, it can easily force inflation into your economy. These are things we'll talk about later. These other pieces we've already covered. In terms of the determinants, one of the things we're going to talk about the next couple of days in here are what we're going to call internal market forces. What creates the conditions for new demand or new supply at the macro level? We covered some of this already when we talked about what determines demand and supply, meaning determinants of demand being things like income, expectations, price of substitutes and complements, etc. Supply being the cost of doing business or the number of sellers in the market. But when you get to the macro level, there's a new set of things that can happen. For example, income can be pushed around by policy. And we want to talk about what that means. On the supply side, external shocks can affect the supply side of our economy as much as new regulations and decisions by the government to change supply conditions internally. So those things are all issues we want to look at as far as whether or not we're moving toward a recovery or what you think of as an expansion or moving toward recession. Any questions on that? Okay. So, the so-called crucial controversy. Well, one of the things that we are very concerned about as macroeconomists is if the government's going to get involved, how much should it get involved? On one far polar aspect or one polar argument is that the government should not get involved. Politically, this has now become what you can say is libertarianism, or even there's the Tea Party politically has this sort of idea that we should have lower government intervention and basically markets should move as they need to. Okay? On the whole other side is very deep socialism. The government should be heavily involved, and we should basically use taxation as a way to redistribute income and reallocate resources such that we don't have rising incomes and wealth, specifically rising wealth and income inequality, and we pull the lower wage folks in our society up toward the middle. And there's a constant clash in Congress in the United States as one example of this around this idea. So how should we use policy levers or what we can do as a government to make growth happen or to make, let's say, better so-called societal outcomes? Okay? And there's a constant split from a philosophical standpoint about this. But that's really more political. Economists have become much more centered on the idea that we need to use government intervention as a tool. The key is which one? Should we use fiscal policy or monetary policy? The last portion of this course is going to be highly focused on that debate and the effects of fiscal and monetary policy on the economy. Okay? So we're getting there. To check that out, what economists have done, which doesn't seem like a huge intellectual leap, is economists have developed an idea at a very base level that's aggregating demand and supply. So if your economy has markets within it, and I look at all those markets added together, I will end up with an aggregate demand and supply curve to analyze. And off the top of your mind, you say, well, we talked about market demand and supply earlier in the course, so what's the difference? The difference is at the macro level, there's different things that affect demand and supply, and supply has a little bit different look to it than in a regular market setting. Okay? So what we're going to do now is we're going to start slowly breaking down each one of those sides of the economy, if you will, and recognizing that there's a lot of good stuff within each side of that in terms of how to analyze a macroeconomy. So let's talk about aggregate demand briefly. Aggregate demand basically takes prices. So one way of looking at this, before I break that down 100%, is just let's look at a graph briefly. And somehow the dotted line has gone away magically on me. Okay? So in a macro sense, we think about aggregate demand as a downward sloping curve that connects all average price levels, P, which we think of as our price index when we talked about, let's say, the CPI, and real GDP. Okay? So as inflation slows down, or in fact as prices fall in the case of deflation, what should we expect to happen to overall GDP? If prices fall, we should expect it to go up. Okay? So the idea is that the law of demand holds at the aggregate level as well. So this downward slope still holds. Okay? But what we need to do now is recognize that if this is real GDP and not the quantity of goods and services, there's going to be different aspects to how price changes affect our macroeconomy. Right? So when we first think about aggregate demand, we have to remember that that little y is really consumption plus investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports. Okay? It's not just some quantity of goods and services, it's actually the summation of all those expenditure decisions. Okay? So, with that in mind, these are the reasons, which should pop up in a sec. Come on, baby. Good. That the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. The first one is called the real balances effect. And so the idea for each one of these in your mind should be, if prices are falling, what does that mean in terms of my decisions with respect to consumption as a household, investment as a business, government spending as a government, business that exports goods and services, and then the decision to import. If prices are falling domestically, will we import fewer goods? In theory. We think. Does that make sense that we would? Should we be able to sell more exports if domestic prices are going down? In other words, will the world look at our goods and see prices going down and say, hey, that's a better deal for me? Yes. So foreign trade, we'd expect to have net exports growing. All right, so that's good. So that's positive, okay? And what that ultimately is the so-called foreign trade effect. Lower price levels in the U.S. would give us both augmented exports and reduced imports simultaneously, in theory, to lead to an unambiguous increase in GDP. Foreign trade effect. When prices fall, the money in our pocket is worth more money or less, or worth more in terms of value or less value. When prices fall, the value of money goes up. So when we have the value of money going up, we get what's called a real balances effect. The real value of our money balances increases as prices fall. So we expect to demand more goods and services because we feel like we have more value. The third reason that the demand curve is downward sloping in the aggregate is this so-called interest rate effect. If prices are falling, what is happening to the real interest rate? Is it rising or falling? What do you think? It's falling for what reason? Correct. So when prices fall, we tend to see more people, we tend to have lower interest rates, which then we have more borrowing, which then generates the so-called interest rate effect. Outstanding. Okay, we have less need to cover against inflation risk. So rates fall. Okay? These are the three reasons why the so-called aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. Now let's break those down quickly and then we'll take a break. If I can get people to generate more GDP by having real balances fall, let's say that, real balances increase in value, generate more foreign trade, or have interest rates change, that sounds like a really good thing for government to get involved in doing. Okay? On the surface. But folks, how do we move along a demand curve in a real market setting? What must be happening to move along the demand curve in the rest of the market?
Prices change.
Prices are changing as a result of this thing that I'm looking for. So you're correct. Let's take one step back from that in the sense that what generated the price change in the first place? We're moving along a demand curve. That must mean that we had a movement of a, or of the, good, production possibilities curve or the supply curve. So when supply moves as a curve, it moves along the demand curve and thus production possibilities change. What we're going to find out in this course, and what you'll find out in life, is that it's very difficult for a macroeconomy to move the supply side of the economy through governmental policy. It wants to believe it does that, and a lot of theory has come out about whether or not fiscal policy has an ability to do that or not. Monetary policy, we're very convinced as macroeconomists, it does not have that ability, even though we call it the money supply. All that does is change demand conditions. It has nothing to do with the supply of goods and services. Okay? It's very difficult to change the supply side of our economy as a government. Okay? So most of our focus as macroeconomists is not really on the downward sloping nature of the aggregate demand curve, believe it or not. Even though that seems very straightforward how you would use government to make things move. Okay? This is our focus, is on aggregate supply. Because aggregate supply, as suggested, is production possibilities. It's an analog to the PPC we've seen. When I can determine the aggregate supply conditions of the macroeconomy, I can determine where full employment exists and then use policy to generate demand to get us there. And that is what we think of as true Keynesian economics, as we'll see throughout the rest of this course. Aggregate supply. So just like demand in a normal market, there's this aggregation of all the goods and services that are produced within a country borders within 1 year that recognizes supply. One of the things about supply, as it says below, is that it slopes upward, but that is actually just a portion of the graph. Okay? It's important that we're going to recognize as macroeconomists that we do not have aggregate supply conditions that are only upward sloping. It is true that most of the macroeconomic activity that takes place is in an upward sloping relationship between price and GDP in terms of the production incentives of firms, but it is not the only place we might be. And that's a very important point, as we'll see in a minute. So otherwise it has very similar characteristics, just like the demand curve does in the aggregate, to a normal supply curve. And that's really the beauty of it, is you don't have to do this gigantic intellectual leap to say, I know how supply and demand works for an individual business or for an individual market. Aggregation of that is really not that much different. What drives the two movements of demand and supply are really the major differences. Okay? Now, as suggested, why is the upward sloping portion of the curve I'll show you in a minute upward sloping? Well, just like regular supply. If prices rise, what is that a signal to businesses in terms of incentives that they can do if they produce more goods and services? They can generate more profit. So there must be a profit incentive for prices rising. If, as prices rise, we get more gross domestic product. Okay? So we have that outcome, so-called profit effect. Classic way of thinking about this is if we get more income as consumers and we start buying more goods and services, prices naturally rise to provide businesses in the aggregate with the incentive to, in a sense, satiate our demands. Okay? And that must be because they're provided with incentives through profit. There's also a cost effect in the sense that as prices rise, that price increase will likely generate higher costs of living, which will lead to higher costs of doing business. So the only way that a business will have an incentive to generate more goods and services is if they can outpace the cost increase through rising prices. These are very close substitutes for each other as an explanation for an upward sloping aggregate supply curve. All right? Very close relationship. But we talked about that before when we talked about supply. That there's not a huge differential between the cost of doing business and changing technology and the increase in suppliers in terms of the determinants of supply, nor in the incentive mechanisms of why supply is upward sloping. The same basic rules apply in the aggregate. Okay? And here are two ways of looking at that. Okay? Not a gigantic shocker here. However, what you start to notice, and this is where the book I'm going to supplement the book here in a minute on this issue, and this is why it was good that you stuck around, because it's highly likely this will show up later. Notice that there's this flat portion, and then this exponential portion rising to a vertical line here. It's very important to recognize that there's all these characteristics. Notice that this is just classic sort of linear downward sloping, even though for some weird reason they put this sort of weird bow into it that's just very slight and subtle. Generally speaking, an economist is going to look at that as a linear function, downward sloping, just like any other demand curve. But the aggregate supply curve, notice, has a little bit different look to it than we've seen in the past. It has this more convex look to it. Okay? Well, just like any other market, there's macroeconomic equilibrium. Okay? And the point here is this, is that if prices are up here, there's going to be too much supply versus demand, and we're going to be driven through price decreases to get to equilibrium. And equilibrium is going to happen where aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply right here at this price, and this quantity are ultimately what is real GDP. Okay? Not a shocker. Right? Not a shocker. Okay? The whole point of this exercise is working just like we already knew. Okay? Are there any questions on that idea? Oh, totally. Just like any other supply and demand idea we talked about in class. Notice we have the downward sloping demand curve, which now suddenly has lost that subtle bow effect from this graph. Notice it doesn't have that same wacky look to it. It actually looks like a straight line. The supply curve looks exactly what we just looked at, with this sort of exponential feel to it, going up. And where the two cross is equilibrium. GDP is determined, the CPI, if you will, is determined there. What the current consumer price index is PE, the equilibrium price on average. And the current GDP level in real terms is here. Now, as an added note, what is the box that's represented by the dotted line of PE and QE equal to? What's the dollar value of that box? That rectangle. Anybody know? We can take a guess. If I have price and real GDP, what must be price times real GDP? Outstanding. The nominal GDP level. Okay? Good. Good. Okay? The second point in this graph is that if prices are at P1 currently, there will be a natural inclination for general price levels to fall, to clear the aggregate market. Just like in any other market setting, we have a current surplus of goods and services. Prices are going to fall in our economy, and you can think of that fall as recessionary. Prices are too high versus where the market wants to be, and prices need to fall to get us to equilibrium. All right? Very good. Now, what this is meant to show you is that you can have a so-called macro failure in the sense that if we want to be here, and we're here right now, some folks would say that that's a macro failure. What is that analogous to that we've seen in the past? What is not being at this point here? which is considered to be full employment output, which is actually, this is a bad graph. I'll show you something different in a minute, but the same basic, the point is still okay. What is happening here, or I should say, what is the difference between this and this that we've already seen before? It's a shortage of the type, in the sense that it's a shortage of demand. But it's not a shortage of a market short setting. It means actually we have surplus conditions in the market, believe it or not. In the sense that we want to get to here, okay? And we need to increase demand to do that, okay? Yes?
Is it like a recession?
It's like a recession. We'll later call this a recessionary gap. Good. But yes,
Not use all your resources to its full potential.
outstanding. When we had the production possibilities curve and we had points inside of that curve, that's a macro failure. And that's point E. To get to point F, we need something to happen. Okay? So the equilibrium output of QE is undesirable if we believe the goal is so-called point F. Okay, but what point F is really trying to show you is that a policymaker believes that the current state of affairs of the economy is not as good as we could, i.e., we're internal to our production possibilities curve. We have resources we can better utilize, so why don't we do something about it? Okay? And thus we can shift these graphs in such a way to get us to QF. Okay. So one way we could get there is potentially shift aggregate demand and get rid of that so-called failure. By doing that, we will increase prices, but one point here is that, at least in this graph, is that if we have a shift in AS that actually goes the other way, we will create a so-called market or a macro failure. A reduction in aggregate supply is one of the key reasons that we see recession take place historically. Okay? So if we have a goal of being at QF, we may be bounced away from that because supply conditions change. Business costs rise, taxes rise, regulations rise, or technology contracts. Okay? For example, and this is kind of a wacky example, but let's think about this. The current Islamic State situation in northern Syria is creating conditions where operating a business in northern Syria has become extremely risky. So the supply conditions in Syria are contracting very quickly, which is causing their economy a lot of problems. In a sense, that's exactly what policymakers in the United States would love to see. The more troublesome the economy is, and the more problematic it is just to generate logistics to get food to markets, people to work, building incomes, can lead to more political pressure in that region of the world to slow down or stop the movement of Islamic State. Okay? So we can see contractions like this because costs of technology are moving in the wrong direction. Okay? What that can cause, as we talked about before, is a market failure, but this is one where it's aggregated because this is happening across the board in the economy. Okay? We would get a rightward shift, or we would be moving back toward full employment if the opposite occurred. Okay? Again, very simple, obvious stuff from the past, but now at the aggregate level. Okay? Good stuff there. Demand contracting toward the origin can also cause a so-called macro failure. If we were close to full employment or where we wanted to be, by demand contracting, we would partly move away from it. But notice what's happening there. The macro failure, and let me go back to the slide and explain this a little bit more deeply. The macro failure here in the aggregate supply case is the worst possible outcome for a macroeconomy. Why? This one here. When there's a leftward movement of the supply curve, that is the worst outcome for a macroeconomy in terms of change. Go ahead.
Because the lower the demand for supply, the lower the amount of businesses have to spend away from
Close.
contractions.
Good. That's close. So the contraction has happened because of the business's decisions given new costs. But what are the outcomes of those decisions? There's unemployment, and prices are going up simultaneously. That's not supposed to happen. If you have inflation, it should be because there's more people employed. When supply contracts, you get unemployment and inflation happening simultaneously. The word for that is stagflation, but it usually is a nasty recession outcome. 1979 to 1982 recession was a supply-side recession, like this. The last recession was a demand-side recession, like this. Contraction in demand toward the origin. But what's kind of cool about that recession is what? Demand is contracting, and that's fine, but what is the consumer gaining from that reduction in demand? Lower what? Prices. So demand-side recessions are technically more desirable than supply-side recessions because while unemployment is happening, prices are falling to sort of reinvigorate the market. Hence, the macro failure is not as deep as it is in this one. But let's review. A failure to get to the desired output of an economy is considered to be a macro failure in a very technical, theoretical sense. If your desired outcome is full employment, you may be pushed away from full employment in a negative sense through either a supply shift to the left, which means there's been some contraction in the ability of businesses to provide goods and services to the economy, or in a demand shift to the left toward the origin because consumers have become less wanting to buy goods and services. Okay? What can cause that? Well, just like in regular demand, we can have spending that just decreases for income reasons, expectations get worse, we can have less disposable income due to new tax laws, etc. Okay? We might see the opposite effect or movement toward full employment and a reduction of the macro failure if we can increase spending, improve expectations, and reduce taxes. So if we think about how government can get involved in our lives and have positive outcomes, these are usually one of the ways that we look at it. Can we increase spending? Can we make better expectations? And can we reduce taxes and ultimately increase disposable income? All right? Are there any questions on the shifting of those two curves? Anybody? All right, good. Now, something to focus on for a later date in debt. I'm now going to digress about what really goes on in aggregate supply and the real movements of policymakers in the macroeconomy. You can take the macroeconomy and boil it down to what an economist would call the short run and the long run. Okay? So let's talk briefly about runs and business cycles in the economy. Short run is when we're not at the desired output point. And we can always sort of default as the so-called desired output as being at full employment. Okay? Full employment is what an economist would call the long run. It means that's the ultimate goal of the economy if the market was left go on its own. It will naturally migrate toward full employment, at least in theory. That outcome is the long run. It's a very special place, and it's actually one point only at which that transition from the short run to the long run takes place. Once you achieve full employment, if you try to push the economy past that in terms of demand, what do you get out of the economy? Rising what? What do you think? If you fully employ the economy and people want to buy more and more goods, you're going to have rising prices, outstanding. Inflation will be the outcome. All right? So we don't necessarily want to go beyond that, but we want to get close to it. Well, a lot of that boils down to how people make expectations and ultimately how much risk there is in the macroeconomy. So economists kind of split the world of forming expectations into two buckets that are very close to analogs to short-run expectations and long-run expectations. And they're known as adaptive and rational. Okay? So in a nutshell, adaptive expectations are when you do not have all the information about a decision, and when a new piece of information comes to you, you adapt your behavior to that new piece of information. Keynes called this idea kind of animal spirits, in the sense that there's a potential mass psychology that takes place in markets based on the fact that individuals do not have a full information set, or they're not fully educated about the economy, or they're simply not willing to pay for the information and thus simply adapt. It's cheaper to do that. Okay? You can think of this almost like a rumor mill. I'm adapting this information. If the rumor's true, I will have already adapted to it. If it's false, I'll readapt based on the new information, and I'm constantly shifting. What do you think adaptive expectations does to a macroeconomy when that is the prevalent way in which we're forming expectations about the future? Does it make it more volatile or less volatile? It makes it more volatile because we're constantly shifting based on new information rather than being more rational about what that new information means, because we have this gigantic information set behind us that we're using and synthesizing with each piece of new information. If you're doing that, that's known as rational expectations. Okay? So an economy is going to be moved around by one of those two types of expectations formation. Adaptive or rational. Generally speaking, rational expectations is reserved for a perfectly competitive, easy market outcome without government intervention, with the idea that both sides of a transaction have the same set of information, we know what each other is going to do, and we rationally move toward a market outcome. In adaptive expectations, some parties in a transaction will have more information than others, and having more information can generate what for you? Outstanding. More profit. Okay? By having more profit and not being able to be as competitive, we generate what's known as a macro failure. So one of the reasons why we cannot move from a non-full employment state of our economy to a full employment state is because we're unable to, in a sense, eclipse that information issue and transition from adaptive to rational expectations. We will talk more about this later in the course, but the reason I bring this up now is because I'm now going to draw for you what you need to remember in terms of the aggregate supply curve. The book has one way of looking at aggregate supply. I'm going to tell you the way that the macroeconomist really looks at it, if you believe that. Yeah. Okay? So from an aggregate standpoint, when I talk about aggregate demand and supply, you want to think that that is just like a regular supply and demand framework, where the vertical axis is the average price level, or what you can think of as the CPI as a proxy for what we'll also call the GDP deflator, some average price metric for the entire economy, and then real gross domestic product, lowercase y, will be our symbol for real GDP from here. Capital Y will be our symbol for nominal GDP, which we will rarely use, because our focus will be on the real outcomes of the economy. Okay? So think of lowercase y, as we'll talk about next time in depth, as being equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Okay? With that in mind, for now, here's the point of this. The aggregate supply curve has three distinct sections to it. A flat portion, which does not look flat, sorry. One moment, please. And that's pretty close. A flat portion. Then an upward sloping portion, and then a vertical portion. Okay? Three distinct sections. Now this looks very similar to the aggregate supply curve we saw before. But notice it was not as complete a picture as this is. But it had some of the same elements. Okay? Now why am I showing you this? I'm showing you this because there's one spot in specific at which we are constantly seeking as macroeconomists, and it's here. That point is the transition point between the short run and the long run. Okay? I.e., it is the transition point between an economy that has some kind of macro failure in it, or is not at its desired outcome, and we've actually reached full employment. And we're going to label that full employment outcome as little y sub FE, or the full employment level of real gross domestic product. We're going to assume that every economy on planet Earth has that outcome as their goal. Okay? The reason we're going to do that is because sociopolitically and economically, it's somewhat tough to sell the idea that we want to end up somewhere below full employment. Okay? So we'll assume that that is the desired outcome. All right? Well, check this out. To get there, an economy Rarely an economy is at zero. When we think about just from a stylized standpoint, we know we're going to start at zero. What is happening as the economy initially grows here? The economy gets to grow without what bad problem? Not necessarily. Loss of profit? Don't say that either. Be more simple. Outstanding. Inflation. Notice that that flat line must mean that we're getting changes in GDP in real terms without commensurate change in inflation. Why? How can an economy pull that off? What must be the conditions in an economy that has the potential to grow from zero to some transition point without prices rising? What must that economy have? Think of China. A lot of people, which is a proxy for a lot of resources. Right? Sorry, maybe I expected too much on that one. Bottom line is that you must have a surplus of resources to not have any scarcity in your economy. And folks, that's the key. There's no scarcity yet. When you get scarcity conditions, in other words, when you have demand greater than supply, what is naturally going to start to happen to prices? They're going to want to go up. So the only way you can explain an economy that is growing without inflation at all is if scarcity is not come into the economy whatsoever. Very rarely will you find an economy like that. Very rarely. Most economies, and this is why the book does this as a stylized example, most economies work on the upward sloping portion of their aggregate supply curve. The reason is because growth generates shortages in certain markets, and even if it's relatively few markets, it'll be enough to push prices up a little. Like we've had in the United States the last few years. We've had inflation, but it's been relatively low. Okay? Come on. One moment, please. So you can think about that upward sloping portion of the aggregate supply curve as basically a transition phase, where you're transitioning from an economy with an enormous amount of resources now having conditions of scarcity creeping into the economy. And notice that the exponential nature of the upward sloping portion of the aggregate supply curve is a reflection of rising scarcity conditions. As scarcity becomes more and more an issue in your economy, how do prices rise? In a geometric fashion or in an exponential fashion? Exponential. Okay? We expect it to move very quickly upward. And then what happens if we get to full employment and we keep pushing the demand side of the economy? Then you get perfect vertical growth. You get nothing out of the economy on the real side, and all you get is an increase in prices. Okay? And that's the long run. Okay? That's where the economy naturally wants to go. So guess what? What policymakers try to do is push an economy into that little ball that I circled there. Recognizing that it's very tough to basically throw a dart and hit that one solid point. But I can kind of be in the ring around it. And if I'm in the ring around it, I'm sort of constantly balancing between an inflationary economy and a slightly recessive economy all the time. So what I want to do is shave the business cycle in such a way on the amplitude side to where the amplitudes are smaller and I'm basically within that ball at all times. What puts us there is aggregate demand. So what I just showed you is the movement of aggregate demand through the stages of an economy from a relatively small economy toward its full employment point and potentially into an inflationary scenario after that. Okay? Why is it important to know these three sections? Well, one is because this is how macroeconomists normally describe aggregate supply and complete. The second is what expectations exist in the no scarcity and the transition portions of this curve. How are people forming expectations that allow us to grow gross domestic product in real terms?
Prices will be going up.
We think prices are going to go up. Correct, but because I have more information than you do, I'll be able to profit off of the price increase faster than you, which means gross domestic product will continue to rise. But that means I must be forming adaptive expectations, because if you and I had the same expectations, we would run right away to that transition point, and we'd both stop because we knew we couldn't get any more profit out of it after that. We would just get nominal gains and not real. So we'd have an incentive to stop moving. But because people form adaptive expectations, what policymakers are ultimately doing with fiscal and monetary policy is trying to shape expectations. If I infuse an economy with new spending, or I infuse an economy with more money, what I'm basically doing is saying, here's the new framework that you should be thinking about, and here's how we're going to form expectations from here. This is where we want the economy to go. Good. Now we all have the same basic information set. Now let's walk to that outcome as if by an invisible hand. Rational expectations and the invisible hand idea are very synonymous. All right? How are we doing with this? This is not in the book. Good. Alrighty. So short-run instability. Two theories emerged after the Great Recession and are still with us today in macroeconomics, because every new wild cycle brings the same debate items back up. Recession is seen as, by a so-called classical economist, a person that believes that we should have very little government intervention and that markets basically self-regulate, as a short-term lack of information in the market that, because of change in the markets, will basically transmit new information to the market and it will naturally work itself out. So don't do anything. Unemployment is a short-term misinformation issue that once everybody understands what's going on, the market will react and we'll go back toward full employment. A Keynesian economist believes that large amounts of unemployment or macro failures are a problem with expectations formation, and governments have an ability to reshape those expectations by reacting quickly and in a very decisive way to move demand back toward equilibrium. But here's the key. A classical economist suggests that the way an economy should be, in a sense, altered by governments is on the supply side. Provide businesses with new incentives to grow, and the economy will take care of itself if you're going to intervene at all. Keynesian economist believes that people just don't get it, and I want to manipulate demand in such a way to consistently help people form expectations. So, for example, if an economy is getting too inflationary, I start to reduce the amount of money in the economy, reduce spending, to depress GDP, to slow down the growth of prices because demand is moving back toward the left, and that slows down inflation. If I want to invigorate an economy, I spend more money, or print more money and put the money into the economy, as we'll find out later in the course. And that will help folks shape toward more consumption and move us toward GDP. So one side believes we should manipulate the supply side if we're going to get involved at all, and the involvement should be very minimal. The other side believes, the Keynesian side believes, we should constantly move demand to force new expectations in the economy and shape that for folks that don't get it. Okay? And that's really what it boils down to. Okay? And notice that there's also controversies about the shape of AS and AD, some of that we just looked at, and how those curves shift. Okay, great. So that means there's basically a controversy about everything. And the answer is that's pretty much true. All right? But as we'll see over this time in the course, from here on out, most modern economies have boiled it down to the idea that we've got to be able to manipulate demand, and that's the key, is aggregate demand manipulation. And that adaptive expectations are generally the way in which economies work, not rational. Okay? You have some rational elements, but not on average. So we kind of talked about this already. I'm just going to move very quickly through this. That Keynesian theory, the things that we will talk about the most in this course, because it is the cornerstone of macroeconomics and the way in which markets look at macroeconomics, believe that the economy moves around on the demand side generally. By manipulation of demand, you get movements in the economy that shape expectations. That's really the main idea of this slide. Okay? What has come from that is the role of money. And in a sense, that's called monetary theory. The idea that this is a demand-side theory is true in the sense that the printing of money and changing the so-called money supply is somewhat deceiving in the sense that changing the money supply changes the overall credit conditions on the demand side of our economy. It does not change the ability of a business to produce. It doesn't change the cost of doing business directly. Okay? And it doesn't change the state of technology directly. It's very indirect and usually has to happen through demand changes to give incentives to businesses to change. So it's demand creating its own supply. And that's a key idea here, is that Keynesian theory reverses Say's law. It says, if Say's law doesn't work, because we've supplied all this stuff and you're still not coming, we got to do something with demand. And then supply will be created because businesses will have incentives to create supply to satiate these new demands. Okay? So in a weird way, you can think of Keynesian theory as the reverse of Say's law. All right? Well, this is something we'll come back to a bunch of times in this course. The idea of so-called tight money is when the central bank says we're going to start taking money out of the system and increasing interest rates. We're going to increase the cost of credit. Easy money is when the cost of credit falls. Okay? Well, if it's more expensive to borrow, what happens to consumption? It goes down. What happens to investment? It decreases. So higher interest rates are usually representative of a downturn in the economy. Lower interest rates are usually representative of an upswing in the economy. We've had relatively low interest rates since 2008 and 2009. What's happened since then? Our economy has grown. Previous to that point, we had rising interest rates. But those interest rates were not high enough to reflect all the risk that was in our economy. And we got hammered pretty hard going into the recession because we all sold off based on the rate of return was not high enough to cover those risks. But when rates go up, they're meant to cover new macro risk, mainly inflation. So this tight and easy money, or the movement of aggregate demand based on new central bank policies, is something we will spend almost 2 weeks on in this class later. Okay? It's very important to recognize that that's the cornerstone of a so-called policy lever that can be pulled by macroeconomy. Are there any questions on the Keynesian theory, the idea of monetary theory? And this is super introductory. Anybody? Good. Okay. Very simple ideas here. We have too much demand, which creates inflation, the movement of AD0 to AD2, very similar to any other market situation. We are increasing inflation more rapidly than we're getting change in real GDP, which means we're slowing down as an economy due to inflation. We're getting closer to full employment. So one of the nasty trade-offs about moving an economy toward full employment is at some point you'll start to create inflation. One of the biggest controversies in our recovering economy is where is the inflation if we've done so much to stimulate demand. So we will talk about that later when we talk about bank regulations and what's happened with credit markets in the wake of the recession. That the way that we think about how Keynesian theory works has been somewhat subdued by new regulatory environments. Okay? On the other side, when there's too little demand, when we move from AD0 to AD1, this is a demand side recession. So how do you cure when folks have reduced their demand, like we saw in the Great Recession? You provide incentives for them to kick it back up. And that's basically what we've been doing in the United States since 2009, and Western Europe's been doing it about the same time period. Any questions on that? So let's take a 30-second review. Okay? The idea is this. If policymakers want to get us to full employment, they have two choices. They can either shift demand or shift supply, not a shocker. What is the major idea for you to remember is that in macroeconomics, we focus 95% of our effort as policymakers and as macroeconomists on the demand side of our economy. Because generally speaking, we all agree that fiscal policy, spending and taxes, and the use of transfer payments by the government in terms of their budgeting and laws affect the demand side of the economy as does changing the money supply. It is very difficult to change the supply side of our economy through fiscal and monetary policy. We can do that more through regulatory environments or opening trade or things that are more about trade policy or general legal environment. We cannot do it through fiscal and monetary policy very easy, if at all. Okay? So we're going to focus a lot on this side of our economy in terms of looking at policy. Are there any questions? Right. Now, like I said, you can move the supply curve as a way of generating more outcomes, but it's somewhat difficult to do that in practice with policy. Okay? So the cool thing about it, it's very enticing to think that you can. If the supply curve moves to the right, in other words, if you can generate conditions in which businesses have lower costs of doing business, they'll have an incentive to increase the quantity supplied at all prices, which will lower prices and increase output simultaneously. That's the best case scenario for an economy. The opposite is the worst case. When business costs rise and contraction in supply takes place, we get stagflation, or we have inflation and unemployment rising simultaneously. We want inflation falling or being subdued and creating jobs simultaneously. That's the best. And that's why there's a lot of attraction to using policies that manipulate the supply side of our economy. In practice, it is very difficult to do. Some classic ways of doing that are providing specific types of business tax credits. In other words, if you make a certain investment as a business, we will give you lower tax levels, so there's an incentive to grow your business based on getting this tax rate. A lot of cities, counties, states do this all the time by giving sweetheart deals to new businesses coming into their city, county, or state. The federal government has struggled with this for a long time, but one way in which we experimented with this a little bit is in solar and in electric vehicles. So in 2009, in the summer, the Obama administration provided money, basically, to subsidize electric vehicle purchases. You may remember this as being the so-called cash for clunkers deal. You have this gas guzzling car that if it got under a certain mile per gallon, you could take it in and you got like $5,000 or $7,000 off of a car that was more fuel efficient. And that lasted for about 4 or 5 months. That was a federal subsidy that was right to the car dealer. It meant to do two things. It meant one, to be an environmental package for political reasons and get people out of gas-dependent cars and into more hybrid vehicles. But it also provided new sales for car companies that were struggling to come out of recession. Okay? The claim is that manipulated the supply side of the economy. It really manipulated the demand side instead. It's very difficult to move the supply side of the economy. Very difficult with policy. Okay? So we like that idea. It's very difficult in practice. Are there any questions on that? Okay. Again, the movement, bad. Moving this direction, prices rise, quantity falls, all bad. Okay, we don't like this. But sometimes we don't control this outcome. Okay? And that slide's just in there. I don't even know why I put that in there now. The self-adjustment mechanism, we talked about this at length. The key is that if we believe markets will move on their own, we may have to endure some seriously long downturn cycles while the economy transitions. We don't like that. But as we move from conditions of lack of scarcity or where we're not at full employment towards full employment, we grow. Okay? And there's some natural rate of output that we're gravitating toward by the nature of our current state of technology. We can't go past that in terms of real output. So that is the goal of policy. All right? Okay. So, I think I'm going to go ahead and stop there because this part here will transition us naturally into the next chapter and the next topics. Okay?